Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. We are going to get started right on the hour here because we do have a lot of information that we want to get to. We want to make sure that we have time for a Q&A at the end. My name is Rosemary Malfi. I am the Massachusetts Pollinator Network Coordinator at the Northeast Organic Farming Association Massachusetts chapter, or NOFA Mass for short. And I am truly delighted to welcome all of you to tonight's seminar on building pollinator habitat through the USDA-NRCS program. I'm going to introduce our speakers in just a moment, but before I do, I just want to review a few things. There we go. For those who might be unfamiliar, the Massachusetts Pollinator Network is a grassroots initiative at NOFA Mass to support and connect the many individuals and community groups across the Commonwealth who are working on aspects of pollinator protection, including ecological landscaping, habitat construction restoration, and reducing reliance on pesticides. In addition to serving as a resource center and communications hub, we also engage in education and advocacy work at the local and state levels, including hosting regular seminars featuring experts. You can visit masspollinatornetwork.org to learn a little bit more about us and our mission. The programming delivered by the Mass Pollinator Network in general, including tonight's event, is free and open to all. And this is thanks in part to our generous sponsors and partnering organizations, which are listed on the screen. And also thanks to the presenters willing to contribute their time and share their expertise. If you feel moved to help sustain our programming and advocacy work in New England, you can make a contribution via our Rally Up page, which you can find through masspollinatornetwork.org, or a link that I'll drop into the chat. You can also support the Xerces Society via their website. Finally, a few Zoom reminders. Because our audience is pretty large tonight, all Zoom participants are muted. And to save bandwidth, we also encourage folks to stay off video just during the presentation part of the talk. And then once we get to the Q&A, it's up to you whether you'd like to come back on camera. A Q&A will follow the presentation. Please submit your questions to the host and co-hosts via the chat function. We have live transcription enabled for accessibility, but if you wish, you can turn off the closed captioning by pressing the little CC button at the Zoom bar at the bottom of your screen. We're going to do our best to get to all of your questions. If we are unable to do so, you can send me a follow-up email. My email address is rosemary@nofamass.org, and I'll provide that again at the end of the talk. And please note that we are recording this event. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let Emily start sharing. And I will introduce our presenters. It is very much my pleasure to introduce our three speakers tonight. Kelly Gill is a senior pollinator conservation specialist at the Xerces Society and a partner biologist with the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service East National Technology Support Center. Emily May, based in the neighboring state of Vermont, is a pollinator conservation specialist with the Xerces Society's pesticide program. And Michelle Cozine is the state biologist for the Natural Resource Conservation Service in Massachusetts, where she works to develop and implement fish and wildlife habitat projects funded through Farm Bill conservation programs. Thank you all for being a part of our program tonight. Please take it away.
Great, thank you so much for having us, Rosemary. Thanks so much to NOFA Mass for hosting this. I'm really lucky to be joined by Kelly and Michelle tonight to talk about programs for conserving pollinators on working lands through the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service. We're going to be talking about, I'm going to give a quick background and overview of habitat needs for pollinators, a little bit of an intro to these programs and what the NRCS is. Kelly's going to walk us through some of the wide variety of ways that habitat can be incorporated into working lands. That's farms and forests, ranches, and other working lands. And then Michelle's going to lead us through a high-level overview of some of these NRCS programs for pollinator conservation. So we're really excited to talk to you about how you can access some of this support for practices and how you can help conserve these really important insects. So just a little background about the Xerces Society, if you're not familiar with us. Xerces Society is a science-based nonprofit organization that's dedicated to protecting wildlife through the conservation of invertebrates, spineless animals, and their habitats. We were named for the Xerces blue butterfly, which was the first US butterfly known to go extinct due to human activities. It lived in the dune habitats around San Francisco. So we work with a diverse set of partners, including scientists, land managers, educators, farmers, policymakers, and other community members. Do a variety of on-the-ground conservation work with programs in pollinators and agricultural biodiversity, endangered species, pesticides, and a community engagement program focused more on urban and suburban communities. The Xerces main office is in Portland, Oregon, but we have on our pollinator and agricultural biodiversity conservation team, we have field staff across the country that are working on pollinator habitat restoration, conservation planning, and technical assistance in agricultural areas, natural areas, and urban lands. So many of these staff hold positions that are joint between Xerces and the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what that means in a minute, but I'm really proud of all of the regional and local knowledge of pollinator conservation that's represented by each of these amazing colleagues on this map. Before I go any further, I just wanted to provide a little bit of background on the NRCS, as that might be something that's a little bit unfamiliar for some of you. It rolls off the tongue for me because I say it a lot, but the Natural Resource Conservation Service is an agency within the US Department of Agriculture that helps people help the land. It's an agency that designs and administers conservation practices and funding for working lands. That's farms and forests and ranches and other working lands. It was originally founded as the Soil Conservation Service in the 30s during the Dust Bowl years, helping farmers to adopt better practices for conserving soil. And its mission has since expanded to conservation of other natural resources besides soil, including plants, water, animals, even energy. NRCS programs are federal, but they vary state by state, and they're administered at the county level. So they are providing financial and technical assistance for conservation on the ground. Everything from one-on-one advice on information and resources based on the latest science, to financial assistance for conservation practices that are actually addressing those larger natural resource concerns on working lands. So again, Michelle's going to be giving us a high-level overview of those programs. Within Xerces and our pollinator and ag biodiversity staff, these joint positions between Xerces and the NRCS are providing technical assistance and support for conservation programs and practices that benefit pollinators, monarchs, beneficial insects. So these partner biologists are going out to sites, evaluating what's already there in terms of habitat, helping to select appropriate plants and design seed mixes for new habitat projects, provide recommendation on how you can establish things from seed, management of habitat, other guidance to try and help improve the quality and quantity of food and shelter for pollinators and other wildlife. So it's a really fun job. We'll circle back to all of this, but I just wanted to start with this basic fundamentals on the NRCS and how Xerces is partnering with the agency to support pollinator conservation. So let's dig in a little bit. I think if you've tuned into this program, you're already aware of how important pollinators are for agricultural and natural systems. Pollinators are what allow wild flowering plants to reproduce and to continue reseeding in their environments. The seeds and fruits that those flowering plants provide are also then food resources for lots of other wildlife, from birds to mammals, including us through the ag systems. So the simple act of moving pollen from flower to flower is building out the base of the food chain for lots of wildlife. The fruits, seeds, and insects themselves are a major part of the diet of many birds and mammals. Caterpillars in particular are a really essential source of protein for birds. About 9 in 10 bird species eat insects at some point in their lives. So the Carolina chickadee pictured here has to gather about 10,000 caterpillars in a period of about 3 weeks to be able to successfully raise their chicks, which is, if you average it out, about 450 caterpillars a day. It's really a wild amount of protein that these birds are getting from pollinators. So insects are this just tremendous source of protein at the base of the food chain. So why do we need to talk about conservation of these species? We don't always have the monitoring data to say one species is in decline or another species is in decline, but there is a good and ever increasing amount of evidence to suggest that on the whole, we're seeing declines in abundance of our pollinating species due to a lot of the same stress factors that threaten other kinds of wildlife. So of course, we need more investment in basic science and further analysis of existing data to know more about the specifics of species declines. But we really can't wait for that level of data on every species. We really know enough to take action. Some of the main threats facing pollinators and lots of other kinds of wildlife are habitat loss, pesticide use and exposure, diseases and competition from non-native species, and climate change. So we're really going to be talking about the habitat piece today. In terms of habitat loss, it's something, we think of agricultural expansion as something that happened in the past, but land conversion that's happening for agriculture as well as for residential development continues to expand rapidly. Between 2008 and 2016, over 10 million acres of uncultivated land were turned into cropland, which is an area that's roughly the same size as Massachusetts. This conversion of land has come at significant cost to wildlife and continues to do so. This habitat loss also means degradation of habitat, so lower quality habitat, fragmented habitat, and sort of chopping up of natural habitats into small patches that could be inaccessible for wildlife. So we know enough to take action. We need all hands on deck. Everyone can contribute. So what can we do about threats to pollinators? We can protect existing habitat where it exists. We can create new habitat. That's a lot of what we're going to be talking about today. And some of us might not be managing lands or might not be eligible for the financial assistance that we're talking about later. But some of us, all of us can work on educating ourselves about pollinators, educating others, and engaging our communities in larger scale conservation. So there is something in here, I hope, for all of us. In addressing many of the overlapping concerns for pollinators, habitat is really the key ingredient. So, and what I mean by habitat is food and shelter for pollinators. Research shows that there's a direct link between the amount of habitat and the abundance and diversity of pollinators and beneficial insects in our landscape. The more that we can protect, the more that we can create, the more bees we'll have helping move pollen around and benefiting natural and agricultural systems. And working lands are really a big part of this conservation puzzle. About 40% of the land on our planet is used for agriculture. And this land use over time has contributed to invertebrate declines. And with the right practices, it can also be a big factor in helping turn that around. So let's talk about what pollinators really need to thrive. Where we find opportunities for protecting and improving and building new habitat for pollinators might differ a bit depending on whether we're in our backyard or if we're out on working lands in a big, large forest patch or on open lands. In the end, what all pollinators need is food, shelter, and refuge from pesticides. So when we're talking about improving habitat for pollinators and working lands, here's what we're really thinking about. There's three main habitat requirements for all pollinators. Bees need diverse flowering plants that provide pollen and nectar all season long. Butterflies also need their host plants, which they can be pretty selective about. In terms of shelter, pollinators need undisturbed spaces to be able to nest in the ground or in a plant stem, or they need also overwintering space to make it through the winter. The vast majority in terms of bees, about 2/3 of the 3,600 species of bees in the US live below ground in the soil. Only tiny holes give any kind of sign that they're even there. So you might not know that you have bees nesting all around you. The other third of bees live above ground in tunnels in old snags or in pithy plant stems that they can hollow out and start laying their eggs in. So we're looking to provide this kind of habitat for pollinators, for shelter resources, as well as flowering resources that they can use to feed their young or to lay their eggs on in the case of butterflies. And then finally, pollinators need protection. They need refuge from pesticide exposure. So as we're thinking about increasing habitat in agricultural lands, we need to be thinking about how we can protect it from pesticide contamination. So this presentation isn't going to have as much detail on bee biology as it might in another talk, but it is helpful for understanding how we design habitat to support bees throughout their lives or other pollinators, to talk a little bit about the life cycle. So this is an example of what a typical solitary ground nesting bee life cycle looks like. So this is a mining bee that emerges in springtime. Most of our native bees are solitary. They generally have a life cycle that takes about a year. The adult stage, typically for these kinds of solitary bees, lasts for about 3 or 4 weeks. So the offspring are in the nest for about 11 months, growing through the egg, larva, and pupa stages. The female will mate once and then spend her adult life creating and provisioning that nest to lay her eggs. So depending on the species, a nest could have maybe 1 up to 10 or 20 cells. And that cell can be formed underground. So she's digging in, excavating her nest, putting in pollen and nectar to provide this ball or sort of bee bread that's almost like a bee loaf that she then lays her egg on top of. And that egg develops through its stages on top of this loaf of pollen and nectar. The eggs kind of look like this tiny white sausage. A few weeks later, that egg hatches, and then the grub-like larva emerges, and the larva grows rapidly for a few weeks before changing into a pupa, and then spends 8 to 9 months sort of dormant underground as this pupa. So this is what a life cycle might look like for a solitary ground nesting bee. When it emerges, the adult bee is fully grown, ready to mate and continue that cycle. And different bees will emerge and fly at different times throughout the growing season for 3 to 4 weeks at a time, which is why we really need something blooming at every time of the year so that there's some kind of food resource available for every sort of new generation of bees that are coming out of the ground or coming out of plant stems. In selecting plants, we're prioritizing plants that are native to the area that we're working in, as those are the plants that have co-evolved with native pollinator species and other wildlife over many generations. And they're typically best suited for supporting the resource needs of those wildlife. So these are some of my favorites for the Northeast US from spring through fall. Just a few really brief selection here from spring ephemeral wildflowers and woody plants that come out in the early spring at that really critical time for a lot of spring bees, through late spring flowers like golden alexanders, summer flowers like milkweeds and joe pye weed, all the way through late fall goldenrods and asters. So something for everyone at every time of the year. And of course, butterflies also need their host plants. Butterflies also have these deep co-evolved relationships with the plants, with these plants, and can be quite particular about what kinds of plants they'll lay their eggs on. These are known as host plants. Some species will use only one kind of plant, like a monarch, of course, which uses milkweed as its host plant. So Xerces maintains lists of host plants that can help people select appropriate hosts to support eggs and larval caterpillars. So this is a resource that you can look at if you're thinking about host plants in your own yards or on your land. The next piece is nesting and overwintering habitat. Native bees also need nesting habitat. Butterflies need overwintering sites. So looking around, finding what you already have on your property in terms of protection for egg laying, protection, undisturbed areas for nesting, stems and leaf litter, tussocky bunch grasses, brush piles, and rock piles can harbor some of this undisturbed habitat for nesting. The most important thing in this is protecting what's already there rather than trying to create new nesting areas. Less is more in terms of nesting habitat management. So while there might not be clear signs, the ground nesting bees are kind of hard to spot. So they're still most likely utilizing a space that is there and may be nesting all around you. And then this is my last slide, just to talk about the final step in habitat creation, which is a reminder that we need to be protecting this habitat that we're creating from pesticides. There are many ways that pollinators can be exposed to pesticides in both urban and agricultural spaces. So we need to be considering the repercussions of pesticide use on these other organisms and taking steps to mitigate, any kind of drift onto flowering habitat and making sure we're not contaminating it with contact from pesticide applications. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Kelly to take us through some of the different kinds of conservation practices that can help us integrate habitat into working landscapes.
Thank you very much, Emily. So I'm going to show some of these practices, and they can be seen as habitat practices that can be applied anywhere in the landscape. Some of the pictures show bigger habitat installations, but a lot of the same criteria when we select plants, like Emily talked about, or including nesting habitat, apply at different scales. So, we can scale up and we could scale down with these types of practices to fit different types of landscapes, whether you're rural or in a more urban setting, whether you have a large farm or a small farm. And these, aren't necessarily specific to farmland. These are practices that can be implemented in, various areas of the landscape. I'm sorry, my cat's here now, of course. But I'm showing you specific ones that are also tied to NRCS practices. And so, for those people that might not be necessarily interested in NRCS practices, these are also ideas that you can implement on your own. So one of and I'll focus on some of the most common practices. There are a lot of practices that NRCS has to address resource concerns and in degraded habitat for wildlife. And so I'm just featuring some of the most common ones for pollinators today. The first one I'd like to feature is wildlife habitat planting. And that can encompass a wide variety of things, mostly herbaceous plantings, like wildflowers and grasses, so native species. We have different options to vary the diversity of these plantings. So when we're talking about pollinators that need a lot of those floral resources throughout the season, those are pretty diverse seed mixes or combinations of plants that we're establishing. And then there's other wildlife maybe that don't need that and they prefer more of a grass habitat, grassland habitat. So we might vary the mix to accommodate that species, but still include a few flowering plants for pollinators as well. So here you can see a wildflower meadow with Monarda fistulosa blooming and a monarch perched on that flower nectaring right there. Next, please. Oh, I could do that. Oh, thank you. This is another configuration of a wildlife habitat planting. This is an infield, so before we were talking about maybe meadows that can be planted, on the edges of fields in areas not used for crops, or if you're taking cropland out of production. This is a practice called Beetle Banks that you can put within crop rows. And all this is establishing rows of permanent vegetation. Here we see bunch grasses in this row right here. And that provides habitat for pollinators if you include flowering plants. But these habitats also accommodate a wide variety of beneficial insects that are important for pest control. So in vegetable systems that are using tillage and ground disturbance that might harm or impact ground dwelling natural enemies like spiders and ground beetles, these areas provide refuge for them to escape harm over winter. And then they're making habitat, claiming residence in your crop field so that they're there to disperse to crop plants when their prey is there. So it's supporting these animals before and after they're needed for that pest control. Next, please. This is just another example of that. Here, these are plantings that are on a little bit of a berm. Beetles and other ground-dwelling beneficial insects like that microclimate. It's a little drier up there, even just a couple feet. And on this picture here, you see a beetle bank that included flowering plants for pollinators. So this can be kind of a beetle bank insectary strip habitat combination. What I want to, really say here is that, don't just generalize and picture these large meadow habitats. These plantings can take on different configurations, big and small, block and linear. And so there's not one way to do things. Next. Shrub planting, hedgerows, and windbreaks. I think people really gravitate toward this model of wildflower meadows. And they are not always easy to establish, especially from seed. You need certain equipment. They need to be managed. You need really good weed control before you seed a meadow with wildflowers. But there are other options like you see here, tree and shrub planting, which is a little more straightforward. I think it's overlooked. And I really think it's valuable because if you picture one flowering shrub, it's so floriferous. There's tons of flowers right in close proximity of each other. And that really enhances the foraging behavior of pollinators. They are able to collect more food and faster when they don't have to fly around from single stem flower to single stem flower. And so building habitat, vertically, if you have a forest edge or a farm lane, putting some flowering shrubs along that lane or along, which is, both of these features are here, or if you have a row of canopy trees, an existing windbreak or field border, bolstering that with a shrub layer and an herbaceous layer. Instead of building habitat out, you're building habitat vertically and creating more habitat niches that way. And that really fits into kind of these linear areas, which is not only good for pollinators, but it creates more connectivity. It could be, a way to connect to other dispersal corridors in the landscape. And of course, we have plantings for riparian areas. So if you are establishing a riparian planting, your first goal might be improved water quality or fish habitat, but you can include flowering plants for pollinators in that as well. So we're always trying to find ways to get more than one benefit out of these plantings. Next. Here's just an example of what I think is a beautiful flowering hedgerow. A lot of times when you talk to growers about hedgerows, they picture something that bisects their field or divides their field up into smaller fields. And we know a lot of people have been removing hedgerows to expand their crop production area. And so to some people, when they hear hedgerows, it's not a good word. Other people don't mind. It all depends on who you're working with. And, we tailor these plans to the goals and the resource concerns of that particular site. But this is just to demonstrate that these kind of linear hedgerows don't necessarily have to be in the field dividing up, cropland, but they can be around the perimeter or along, access roads or the farm lane here. Next. We also have a practice called conservation cover, which formerly we did a lot of pollinator work under, and we still do. The new practice I told you about, wildlife habitat planting, has taken place of some of that work. So we've moved some of that pollinator work into that other practice. But this is a practice that covers a wide range of different resource concerns. The overall goal is to get permanent vegetation on the ground. Next. And this could come in the form of lower diversity plantings. So as I was mentioning earlier, grass cover, plants that may, or mixes that may have introduced species in them as well, like you see in this pasture over here, bolstering that up with some some legumes and clovers can benefit pollinators. This picture is a little bit later in the season, but it's just a grassland planting that was done under this practice. It has a lower diversity of plants. And so that's the practice we plan that under. And so these options are available as well. Next. This practice can also be used within a crop field for row covers. So here is, some permanent row cover in an orchard system that helps not only, infiltrate water, protect the soil from eroding, but you can include things like clovers and other legumes that are compatible with that cropping system to provide nectar and pollen for pollinators and those beneficial insects as well. And that grass cover helps to provide them kind of a ground cover for habitat. Next. Cover cropping, we can use multi-species cover crops or flowering cover crops to provide habitat for pollinators. Grass or grain cover crops are important for those beneficial insects as well, providing that ground cover, that thatch or residue is important for providing habitat and overwintering protection for those natural enemies. Next. This is a case study on a hops farm. And so this model is using the ground cover in between the rows, similar to what I showed earlier on the apple orchard. This is an organic farm. They did not use pesticides. They had very highly droughty, sandy soils. They tried to get many things established in those alleyways between the hops vines, but they just failed. And so they asked for help. They wanted to build the soil, reduce erosion, increase water efficiency, and attract beneficial insects. Next. This is what our starting conditions were, right? And so what they would do is basically till between the rows to fight weeds, but still vegetation was pretty sparse just because of the droughty and sandy nature of the soils. And so we did a seeding of clover and some of the more drought tolerant grasses. Hard fescue is one of them, perennial ryegrass, and then ladino clover, which is that Dutch white clover that handles traffic. And so it can be mowed and driven over and not impacted as much as some other plants that would be harmed by those activities. Next. And this was the result. So you can see how much more lush that habitat is, how they have all that nice green ground cover, this big, nice swath of clover in the center here. And so these are just examples of different ways that people might not think of to benefit pollinators and beneficial insects. This also improves soil health, which is really the basis of healthy plants, right? We all should know that. And so one thing that we might not be thinking of is when we are managing soil resources and cropland properly, we have healthy plants, and healthy plants are less prone to stress. And that means that potentially they're, receiving less pest pressure and less pesticide application as a reaction to that. And so we really want to promote those healthy soils and healthy plants as well. Of course, we have all these different flowering covering crops, and so long as they're allowed to flower before they're terminated, or even just a portion of them allowed to flower, they're benefiting a wide array of beneficial insects and pollinators. So here we have buckwheat, sunflower, and a grass and legume vetch mix, all really attractive to pollinators. However, they only provide that resource temporarily. So you aren't helping them through their entire life cycle here. You're just giving them a boost of pollen and nectar resources. So keep that in mind. These practices benefit the most when they're combined with some of those permanent habitat practices. Next. Oh, this is just another kind of slide highlighting some of those cover crops that are beneficial. Crimson clover, you see bumblebees on that all the time. brassicas, the cowpeas, buckwheat I showed earlier. Here you see a monarch visiting, and partridge pea. We use this in a mix, and it's also used kind of as a non-traditional cover crop. Next. This is just a study here that I like to highlight. We're all familiar with stink bugs. And so this was a study that showed that flowering crops, like you see buckwheat here, near soybeans, and this was, again, a buckwheat crop that they planted, increased wasp parasitism of stink bug eggs by 2.5 times. So our parasitic wasps, they can parasitize different pests at different life stages. This particular wasp is a parasitoid of eggs, of stink bug eggs. So she'll lay her egg inside a stink bug egg. And as her larva develops, that larva eats the stink bug egg and develops on that food and emerges as an adult. And so it's a pretty vicious cycle, but an interesting way to watch these pests perish. And this just shows that, you may be planting something for pollinators, but we also see all these other benefits, in particular with attracting beneficial insects that suppress pests. Next. Here's an example of a temporary insectary strip that was planted along with apple trees, right? So you see kind of them installing the orchard on this side. And this is a lower cost annual mix. So we wouldn't use something like this mix within a habitat planting in a natural area or something that's supposed to be perennial, because you won't get that long-term benefit, but just another way that you can incorporate flowering plants into the cropping system. This is a farm in New Hampshire. Next. Crop rotation, this goes back again to that concept of soil health and having healthy crops and breaking that, disease cycle. So as you're rotating these crops, having that variation in different crop beds, you can use some of these temporary plantings in those fallow areas. So if you're rotating crops and you have fallow fields within that crop rotation, establishing some of those temporary flowering mixes or cover crops can be beneficial as part of that rotation. Next. This is an example here. Now this is a large farm, but you can scale this back to a smaller mixed vegetable operation. And this just shows the type of rotation that you could plan out ahead of time. And you can see year one here, they have clover and oats, and then they have field peas. And then, so these are kind of those covers. And then they move into crops like peppers and eggplants and broccoli. And here they have fallow, and up here they have fallow fields. So using those fallow fields as opportunities to establish flowering cover crops or temporary insectaries can be really beneficial. Again, for that temporary forage as part of the system, and also to condition that soil and keep it covered so you don't get weed invasion and things like that. Next. Reduced tillage is very important, not only for the natural enemies I was talking about earlier, so those beneficial insects that kind of are ground dwelling, but if you have flowering crops, flowering vegetable crops, you're likely having pollinators nest in your crop fields. And we see this a lot with squash plants. We have a squash bee that's a squash specialist that will nest almost directly under cucurbit plantings. And they're very good at finding those plantings. And so tillage can be something that can interrupt their nesting, right? Or destroy nests. Depending on the species, they nest at different levels, different depths of the soil. So reducing tillage, in particular, if you're noticing that you see bees nesting in the soil, is very, something that can be done to protect those nests. If the nests are destroyed, and if those larvae in the nests are impacted during development, that's next year's generation that's wiped from the landscape. So we want to be careful with our management practices as well. Next. So, these reduced tillage systems, as I said, it also destroys soil structure, disrupts soil life. I'm going to get to something else that's really exciting a little bit beyond pollinators in our next few slides here. This helps erosion, as I mentioned before, healthy soil, healthy plants. And this can be, something that can also help those ground nests and beneficial insects as well. Next. Termination methods, for these cover crops. A lot of people say, well, you say to plant cover crops, and sometimes that termination method is to till them in, right? And so how do they, how can you make that compatible in a no-till system? You can use something like this roller crimper or mowing or other, instruments that don't actually disturb the soil. Like the roller crimper here, you can see it just kind of lays that cover crop down as thatch. It breaks the stems and lays it down. So you have that continued cover on the field. And sometimes, you just have to be careful about how you're doing these practices. There's not always a perfect answer for what you need to do to grow your crops and protect pollinators. But these are some considerations that you could implement. Next. This is actually a project ICP study that Emily May had worked on in the past. And I like to use this as the benefits of conservation tillage. This is Campbell Farms in Pennsylvania. They have a fairly large 200-acre diversified operation and 400 acres of pumpkins. And here that they established rye and vetch mixed cover crops and actually planted the pumpkins into it after terminating that vegetation with the roller crimper I showed. And they had a lot of benefits across the farm, including a reduction in pesticide use. So that was really, that's a nice story that you can read at the link here, and we can provide that to you to get more details. Next. Here's kind of the overview of those benefits. So before the cover crop and conservation tillage practices, this farm was renting honeybees, which cost $135 per hive per acre. So times that out over the 400 acres. After, they cut back on the number of rented honeybee hives by half in most fields because they were supporting more native pollinators. And here's some pictures of those squash bees I was referring to earlier on this bottom picture. And so that was a substantial savings and a conservation benefit to pollinators, of course. And this was, benefiting a diversity of wild bees, many of which are important pumpkin pollinators. Next. Something that I didn't get to go into a lot that is a new part of our work here is farming with soil life. And so we've been talking a lot about pollinators and, predatory insects for pest control, but we really have a humongous amount of diversity of invertebrates in the soil. And so there's a lot more practices that benefit those particular soil organisms. And so if you're interested, you could read this Farming with Soil Life online, and we have several webinars available about it as well. But this is another, angle we can use these practices to benefit that soil resource concern. We also have lots of practices. In fact, we have a new initiative for urban and small farms within the USDA. And so, pollinators are an opportunity there as well. Through the practices I've mentioned that kind of are tailored more to these small spaces. And we also provide things like soil testing. We have soil scientists that can help with soil testing, looking at contaminants in soil in these urban areas. So we do have, programs for smaller farms, smaller spaces, and urban farms and community gardens. So if some of those practices I showed before look really big and not like your landscape and out of your reach, please know that we work, in these smaller scales as well. Next. Some things I didn't get to go over are other practices that support, soil invertebrates as well as pollinators, are pest management practices to try to reduce pesticide use and focus more on prevention and cultural techniques, forest stand improvement, tree shrub planting, windbreaks I mentioned, alley cropping, prescribed grazing, forage harvest management. This is particular to, pasture systems that may have flowering components, and restoration and management of rare and declining habitats. We also have practices to manage existing habitat. So if you already have good habitat, it may not be that you need to start over, that you just need to adjust management to foster that. And I believe this is my last slide before I turn it over to Michelle.
Thank you, Emily and Kelly. And thanks for the introduction to the Natural Resources Conservation Service. This evening, I'm going to be reviewing USDA programs available to landowners and land managers interested in establishing pollinator habitat. Not as interesting as all those practices and everything else you just learned about, but important nonetheless. Next, please. So the financial programs at both the Natural Resources Conservation Service and our sister agency, the Farm Service Agency, are funded with federally appropriated funding through the Farm Bill. 2008 was the first Farm Bill to recognize the importance of pollinators and their habitat and make it a priority for every land manager and conservationist. This was the Farm Bill that encouraged the inclusion of pollinator habitat in USDA programs. They identified pollinator habitat as a priority for EQIP, one of our more popular cost share programs. And they required that pollinators are considered in the review of practice standards, all those practices that Kelly just reviewed. Every practice has to meet a particular standard and specification, and this was the first time they included that. The 2014 Farm Bill maintained these provisions, but they added additional provisions to support habitat for beekeepers. And our current Farm Bill, the 2018 Farm Bill, also maintained these provisions, but recognized pollinators as vital to U.S. agriculture. And they expanded eligibility for NRCS programs. And an example of that, certain provisions were removed. In the past, NRCS was only able to assist producers of food or fiber or forest landowners. And they removed those provisions to allow access to folks who weren't, on this, in this technical definition of a producer. And they also removed the provision that you had to have a minimum $1,000 worth of product, these food or fiber products, among other expanded eligibility things. And I can answer some of these questions, or if you reach out to me after or contact the field offices, those are the people who can give you more details. Next, please. So we all know the benefits of pollinators and how important they are. Pollinator decline affects food security, and lack of habitat is a stressor on the bees. But let's stop to think about the benefits of other insects in our food systems. The beneficial insects that Emily and Kelly were discussing. Not only pollinators, but these beneficial insects were also included in the 2014 Farm Bill. Biological control, as Kelly had discussed, on control of insect pests on crops, very important to our organic producers. Not only fewer pesticides in the system, but time scouting for insects and removing pests. The increase in biodiversity and resilience. And I dare to mention increase in crop yields because I personally have worked with folks who in their first season of installing pollinator habitats saw increased yields in existing crop and came back and installed more in subsequent years because they found it so beneficial. Next, please. So the Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS, is an agency within the USDA that helps design and administer conservation plans and funding assistance for landowners and farmers to address resource concerns on their land. These are federal programs funded through the Farm Bill, as I said, and they vary by state. There are state and national priorities that each state defines. The resource concerns associated with pollinators and beneficial insects are terrestrial habitat for wildlife and invertebrates and soil organism habitat loss and degradation. These are both national and state priorities here in Massachusetts. These resource concerns are addressed by installing habitat, most under that suite of, there's a suite of practices under wildlife habitat planting that Kelly first mentioned, along with others such as field borders, the conservation cover, as well as soil health practices such as no-till and cover cropping and crop rotation, which she also discussed. And the next few slides, I'm going to review the various programs and funding support that's available through NRCS and the Farm Service Agency to support pollinator and beneficial insect habitat development. Next, please. So I've listed the more common NRCS and FSA Farm Service Agency programs where pollinator habitat development is funded. Conservation Technical Assistance, or CTA, is just that, technical assistance. This could be brief, such as sharing publications, a telephone call, or completing a farm visit to identify resource concerns, develop a conservation plan, which outlines those resource concerns and how to address them. And financial programs expand on the CTA, where the client actually applies to be funded for these, to address these resource concerns by installing these practices, various practices, which Kelly reviewed, but as she said, there's just a tremendous amount of conservation practices offered through financial assistance, primarily the EQIP program, which I mentioned briefly, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. The Conservation Stewardship Program is another program which, well, actually, I think I'm going to go into more detail in the next few slides, but CSP, Conservation Stewardship Program, Conservation Incentive Contract, CIC, WRE, RCPP, CIG, this is a Wetlands Reserve Easement Program, Regional Conservation Partnership Program, Conservation Innovation Grants. These are all financial programs that assist financially. The WRE, RCPP, and CIG are more regional projects. They could be multi-state programs where outside specialists might partner with NRCS to complete certain projects, install certain practices regionally. And then the Conservation Reserve Program, which is offered through the Farm Service Agency, is also, it's more of a rental program. I'm going to review that one. I wanted to mention that TechNote, it's outdated, this 2014 Farm Bill programs for pollinator conservation, but it's kind of the first, well, second edition. We have come such a long way since then. And we have hundreds of documents regarding pollinators and beneficial insects now that we use for guidance, many prepared by our expert partner, the Xerces Society, but also NRCS has a technical science centers and plant material centers and all sorts of places where these guidance documents for the planning of these practices are written. Next, please. So I'm going to start with the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or EQIP. It provides financial assistance to agricultural producers who address natural resource concerns and deliver environmental benefits, such as improved air and water quality, conserved ground and surface water, increased soil health or reduced soil erosion on their operations, livestock manure management, mitigation against increasing weather volatility, and what we're here tonight for, improving or creating habitat for wildlife and invertebrates. EQIP is the most common program where these pollinator and beneficial insect and soil health development plans are funded. That's where most of our assistance requests in the field office are for the EQIP program. As Kelly said, there's a large range of practices to address these resource concerns. And every practice has a cost share payment rate attached to it. And how it works is once the practices are installed, you have a conservation plan developed to address the resource concerns. You install these practices. Once the practices are installed to meet the specifications, you are reimbursed for the fees to install those practices. Kelly mentioned this. New for 2022 is an emphasis through the EQIP program on urban growers. There are increased cost rates for smaller scale practices. There's also preference for our historically underserved groups, including those who identify as socially disadvantaged, veterans, limited resources, or beginning farmers who have been farming 10 years or less. Next, please. There's also an organic initiative through the EQIP program. This helps organic producers improve their operations to meet the National Organic Program requirements. They could have a conservation plan tailored to their needs through the transition period. And they're still, eligible for all the other practices, but they'd be tailored for their transition. Most popular is to have a conservation activity plan specific to their system plan. And I wanted to mention here too that the Farm Service Agency offers once a year an organic certification cost share program, which reimburses farms who have just completed certification. It can reimburse the farm up to 50% of those fees. And sometimes it's not even offered every year. The last time it was offered was this last fall, and it's to cover the costs in the prior year. So next slide, please. The Conservation Stewardship Program is a long-term program. This is a 5-year program that folks enroll. They must enroll all their land in this program. It's also incentive payments, but most of these folks have applied to EQIP in the past. Most of the CSP participants have applied to EQIP. They've addressed all the resource concerns on their properties. And that's kind of a reward for being good stewards. And you have to, you're required to install enhancements to what you've already done. You're required to maintain what you've already done, but maybe take it to the next level. And a lot of folks choose to install pollinator habitat, another wildlife habitat. That's usually some of the most popular. It's not a lot of cost, and they receive an annual payment to maintain these, which is nice. And the more resource concerns they've addressed at the time of sign up, the higher the annual payment, which is also nice. Next slide, please. Conservation Incentive Contract. This is brand new this year as well. This CIC falls under the EQIP program. It's a little bit of EQIP and it's a little bit of CSP, the program I just reviewed. It's a long-term contract for 5 years, but you're not required to enroll all your land. But like EQIP, you must address resource concerns, and you must address those resource concerns at a higher level. And an example of this is an EQIP participant who maybe had some soil health resource concerns, and they had addressed these concerns by installing, cover crop over the last few years. But some of their land, say, still is low in organic matter, some of their soil, and they'd like to enroll this, but they wouldn't be eligible for the same type of practice that they had completed in EQIP unless they upped their game a little bit and say maybe planted a multi-species cover crop mix or something like that. So it's a good fit for some folks who still have resource concerns to address elsewhere on the property. Whereas the CSP program, where you enroll all your land, you've done all the work. But again, CIC is brand new. And we haven't had many participants yet, but it's still early in the year. So next, please. And I wanted to talk about this, the Farm Service Agency's Conservation Reserve Program, or CRP. This is a land retirement program where it's a rental rate per acre. In Massachusetts, that's $15 an acre. But this is to retire sensitive areas, for instance, an area that might have, highly erodible soils, or with declining wildlife habitat, ground and surface water. These are areas that might be sensitive and could, benefit from being enrolled in a long-term contract. This isn't so popular in New England because the rates are not, very high. Honestly, it's more of a program that's for large landowners with many acres. It's not so popular, but the most popular practices for those who do enroll in this program in Massachusetts is pollinator habitat. I think that's my last slide. Next, please. Oh, contact your local NRCS field office. There is a directory online. Every state has their own website. I personally find it easiest just to Google Mass NRCS or New Hampshire NRCS. You'll go right to the website, and there's a contact us tab, which will lead you right to your local field offices. It's by county. And it's also got lots of other stuff. It'll explain all the programs in more detail that I just described. It will let you know when these application periods are open, and lots of, press releases and fun and exciting things that we've been doing. And the service centers are now open. They've been closed, but now they're open for walk-ins, and folks are always available by phone or email, or you can reach out to me and I will refer your request to the local field office in Massachusetts. Thank you. And I think we're all going to take questions now.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Kelly. And thank you, Emily, for that great presentation. Very informative. And I learned about some new programs that I didn't know about. So we will open the floor to questions, and please put them into the chat. There are some that have also rolled in while the presentation was happening, and so I'm going to try and get to some of those. Some of them are technical questions about establishing and managing habitat, and then some are about the programming. There were several questions about cover crops. One was, why use a lower diversity grass cover? Is it just for cost, or is it what was best for that particular site? That would be a question probably for Kelly.
So, what we're planning for is that particular resource concern to start off with. And so in cover crops, it might be that their soil needed something, a grass or grain cover crop could provide over a legume cover crop. When we're talking about pollinators, there's reasons for having a less diverse planting. One example here is in New Jersey, we do a lot of work for bobwhite quail. And so we're typically planting grassier mixes and some shrubby areas. But we can tailor those mixes to include some forbs and wildflowers that would benefit pollinators as well. And so it really depends on what the main goal is. We're addressing that first and maybe adding in considerations for pollinators, or if pollinators is the main goal, we're going to go with one of those high diversity mixes. And Emily, Michelle, you may have some examples of that too as well for your experience. But yeah, there's various levels. The seed cost of wildflowers is very high. And so sometimes we have to ratchet back on that and say we're making an improvement. Is it the extreme gold star standard? Maybe not, but that's not realistic in every situation.
Great. Okay, some of the questions I know folks have asked about cover cropping, I think could potentially be answered in a follow-up email. So I'm going to move on from those for right now, but if we have some more time after we get to some of the programmatic questions, I will come back to them. So one question is that just came in was about minimum acreage. So is there a minimum sort of amount of land, I guess, for the entire property, or maybe for the kind of habitat that you're going to install that would qualify you for the program? And maybe that's changing based on what you said.
New this year, we have small farm practices that are specifically for 1 acre or less.
Okay, that's great. Someone is also asking, are the EQIP or CSP funded programs tailored in any way for municipal land pollinator initiatives? So I think there are a couple of questions I think getting at, are sort of non-agricultural lands potentially sort of inbounds for these kinds of programs?
Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, and I was hoping this would change in the latest Farm Bill, we're unable to assist municipalities.
I will add that the Xerces Society does have some community-based programs like our Bee City program, which, you know, might be an initiative that they can look at.
And that's for technical assistance, right? And providing information. It's not a cost sharing program, correct?
Right, correct. But you know, they could get some expertise and some certification as a bee city and signage and things like that. And so that can be helpful if they're raising funds for the actual materials, you know, on their own. And there are some local programs for that. I'd have to look up, you know, what would be available in the question askers area or state.
And then there was also a question, does NRCS work with the forester, maybe with any forestry departments enacting management plans in Massachusetts?
Developing a plan, or we do partner with the Department of Conservation and Recreation, who the state foresters have to approve developed forest management plans. But yes, we partner with DCR, and I don't know, we also fund the development of these plans, if that's what the question might be. The first plan can't be a second or, you know, subsequent plan. The first management plan is something that is funded through the EQIP program.
Again, there's so many eligibility questions. I'll ask this one because I think it is slightly different from the municipality question. Are there programs available for private or I suppose public land trusts? So, you know, I know some land trusts, they're historically at least, you know, agricultural land. Do they in any way qualify for?
Yes, nonprofits are eligible for financial assistance.
Great, okay, that's great. And okay, I'm going to swing back to some of the other questions about implementation. So one was about concern over using cardboard and what happens. So if you're using, you know, like sheet mulching, or if you're using cardboard, what happens to the soil dwelling organisms, and is it actually a problem for them? That'd be an Emily or Kelly question.
I don't have a specific answer for this. I mean, usually when we're doing sheet mulching, it's on a fairly small scale. We're not doing it on, you know, the acres level. And so, you know, I would imagine that the impact would be low for, you know, temporarily, but I don't have a science, you know, backed answer. Emily?
Yeah, I'm not sure on that one. You know, I've seen sheet mulching used for, again, smaller plantings, and so these areas are then recolonized by anything that might have been sheet mulched out temporarily. But yeah, I'm not sure from a research standpoint what it says about soil invertebrates right underneath the sheet mulching.
Cool. That also goes to a question that someone had about meadow establishment. So I imagine the answer is that it varies, but someone was asking about the best way to prep about an acre of land, so that sort of scale, turning it from a lawn into an area for pollinators.
Yeah, I mean, there's organic and non-organic ways to do that. And so we have guides on both of those that I could put on the follow-up list of things that we're going to send out to participants. The main thing is, you know, getting the competition and current vegetation suppressed and basically eliminated from that site for seeding. And so that can be, you know, repeated tillage. It could be tillage combined with smother cropping. It fits sod, and if it's a small area, you can do, you know, kind of scraping or sod removal. There's a variety of ways to do it, both organically and with, herbicide. So I could send those, documents out. But yes, it is very important to prep the site, and it's usually like the most boring part of the practice, and people want to jump the gun and get right to seeding and seeing wildflowers, but they establish slowly, the perennial wildflowers do. And so if they have competition, you're going to end up with something weedier than the nice diverse mix you wanted to see, that desired condition that you were thinking of. So we have guides that go through this step by step, and I'll add those to that resources list.
Excellent, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Somewhat relatedly, this is again an establishment question. And I think I heard you say in the talk too, that sometimes the best course of action is not actually to start from scratch, but to kind of work with what you have. And so this is related to that. If you have sort of a fallow, meadowy area already, and you're trying to integrate more wildflowers into that area, is there something short of like, starting all over that you can do for that area?
Mm-hmm. Depends what the vegetation is. I mean, it could be an altered mowing regime. It could be that, invasive species control, if there's invasive pressure, removing those. And it could be that you introduce diversity to parts of it. So maybe you're not doing a whole takedown, but maybe some patches where you're introducing some of that diversity. And we see this with our meadow plantings over time. They get dominated by grass. So we often go in and do some, selective editing or adding some more diversity back.
And we do have a resource that we can add to the resource list that's about interseeding to diversify wildflower plantings. But yeah, I think all of the things Kelly mentioned are ways that you could take a meadow and try and introduce diversity over time.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes just treating those unwanteds, you'd be amazed what comes up.
Yeah.
Sometimes there are seed beds that have, plants that have been choked out for years that are, something that you never thought you'd see. That just happened recently. Yeah.
Yeah, we didn't talk a lot about invasive species control, but it can really, my husband just scared the crap out of me. But it's, it is really detrimental to our native plant communities, and controlling that, has kind of monumental value, I would say. So if there's nothing else you can do, that's a good thing to focus on.
Someone also asked about concerns about follow-up management. So, weeding and watering, and basically just not wanting something that you invest a lot of energy in to fail ultimately. So maybe could you speak to what is usually done and what actually leads to success? And then I have a follow-up programmatic question to that too.
Yeah, these things need management to get established, and a lot of, a few years of upfront work to get them established can really, it can be quite intense depending on what the starting, conditions are. But over time, that need for constant management declines, and you might be, mowing every couple of years, or patch mowing in sections just to keep, like if it were a meadow, just to keep it from growing back into woody plants. Hedgerows and things like that they definitely need protection from deer to get established. And over time that can change, and you have well-established plants that tolerate a little more, and then they might need occasional care to prune, which we don't do a whole lot of, and replacing unhealthy plants here and there. So it's not it's not easy in our landscape where we have so many pressures, like invasive species and other things, and animal damage pressure. So unfortunately it does come with work tied to it. I wish I had a really we get asked that all the time. What's the most low maintenance thing I could do? And there is some work tied to it. And so we try to let people know what to expect.
I will say that the work is often front loaded, right? In these establishment of these perennial habitats. It's the controlling weeds ahead of time, getting the site prepared, mowing, the annual weeds that are coming up or biennial weeds that are coming up in the first year or two after planting, and letting the perennials come up. But once they are established, or once you have your hedgerow watered and maintained, they can last a very long time. They can be really persistent and low maintenance. I'm all about, low maintenance landscapes, but it does take some work on the front end.
I'm going to go back to the program question in a minute, but a question came in about fire. Is prescribed fire used as a management technique in any of these programs, or to bring back native plants? And then someone asked a related question, which is, are there alternative methods, because fire can, disturb the soil? So the first one is it used?
I'll address the first part just by saying, some disturbance is needed, right, to keep these open habitats. We're fighting nature because where we are, we're in forest lands. So some disturbance is needed, and it's the way that's applied. So if we had, a large meadow area and we were doing burning or mowing, we would alternate that in sections. So maybe we're mowing a third of that or disturbing a third of that habitat in any one year. With fire, it could be a good tool, but it's not used a lot in the Northeast because we have a lot of people in our landscapes. And so there's, a lot of rules that you need to follow to do a prescribed burn. And I'll let maybe Michelle talk about if you're doing any of that in Massachusetts.
We have had meadow situations where they have been mowed continuously for years, not hayed, where it's coming off, but just layers and layers of thatch, where burning was one of our best options to remove some of that thatch, or come in with a flail mower or something where we could remove some of this thatch. It didn't work out for other reasons, but that was our primary tool for this large meadow. It's still a project that's it's still in motion. So you have such a small time frame for burning, and it has to be just right. Can't be too dry. Can't the wind has to be a certain way. Has to be pretty perfect, and it didn't work out timing wise. But it is definitely a tool that, the airports use, airports that are managing for grassland birds, all these native grasses out on the airports, that's their tool of choice to keep weeds down. And so it's effective and it is possible. It's just, it has to be just right.
So related to that management question, I think I heard you say, Michelle, that one of the state priorities in Massachusetts is to improve habitat for beneficial soil dwelling organisms. So presumably that means also promoting no-till practices, right?
Yes.
Does this mean that there is support, financial support for something, for equipment? So something like a no-till seeder or something like that. Is that something that can be?
NRCS does not, but the state's Mass Department of Ag Resources has specific grants available for no-till equipment. The acre grant is something they could look up. I can put some of this information, but it's a climate resiliency program. And twice a year, it used to be once a year, but the program was so popular for no-till equipment that they open the application period now twice a year. Very popular. especially in the valley here on our, flatter areas. No-till can be challenging depending on the landscape. But yes, not in NRCS, but state. Some of our conservation districts in Massachusetts own no-till equipment and will rent that out to producers in the area. But yes, NRCS can assist with adaptive management trials where you may not want to put all of your land into no-till, but you'd like to transition there. So we could do a trial where you're paid to test it out in a plot or two. And, again, all those practices that we mentioned for soil health that benefit these invertebrates, like, the cover cropping, crop rotations, no-till, maybe these adaptive management trials. Yep.
Awesome. And just a quick plug that the Berkshire Conservation District a couple of years ago was one that got that no-till cedar, and they are, I think, taking proposals to rent it out currently.
I actually see Cynthia. I actually see the district administrator in the audience here. Cynthia.
Hi, Cynthia. And Don was asking, are there annual farm flower crops eligible for EQIP pollinator funded programs?
Does this mean you're growing flowers as a crop?
I believe, yes, that is, yes, he says yes.
Yeah, so yeah, typically we're not helping establish a cropping system or something like that. It has to be in action to get, assistance. So
the flower farm would have to be pre-established and then could potentially be eligible for other.
Yeah, like it's unless it's a wildlife planting or something like that.
Right. Great. Well, we are coming up to 8:30 and you all have answered quite a few questions. I know that we did not get to them all, but I have a record of all of the questions that were asked. Some of them are about like what to put where, and the Xerces Society, I know, and maybe NRCS too, have lots of documents that tell you kind of what to plant where. So I will compile those questions and I can send them over to our presenters, and they can point us to some of those general resources that folks can reference. Great. Well, thank you all so much for this presentation. I learned a lot. I hope folks in the audience had some of their burning questions answered. And again, if you have any more questions, feel free to just send them my way. I'll put it in the chat one more time to everyone. This is my email address. So if there's something that you really needed answered and it wasn't, feel free to email me and I will figure out how to get your question addressed. So thank you everyone so much. I so appreciate you being here and have a wonderful night.